first I wanted to say that, you know, on this panel here, you have, for me, people who are really my heroes for human rights work in the United States and the organizations they represent. The work they're doing is the work that is really the responsibility of the state, of the government of the United States. The work that Deborah is doing with the Los Angeles Community Action Network is the work that the local authorities, the state authorities, and the federal authorities in the United States should be doing to make sure that every citizen has the right to adequate housing. The creative work that Tyler is doing with this beautiful film about a building where artists are being thrown out, where root shock is going on, and the very important significance of that is educating a public that doesn't really know anything, not just about the right to adequate housing, but of the enormous damage that is done economically, psychologically, culturally, to a community, to a nation, to an international community, when these kinds of massive violations take place. So for me, this is really part of the story here in Geneva, and I'm so glad that they came here. The question about, in particular about litigations, reminds me that in the United States, there are probably more lawyers per capita than any other country on the face of this earth. And yet most of them don't know anything about international human rights law. And it further reminds me that the United States really is an outlaw nation when it comes to international human rights. Some rights, yes, the United States does embrace them and champion them. Some. But it's very selective. It's like human rights a la carte, or human rights smorgasbord. I like that right because this right is good for a certain set of people, but all those other rights, no, that's for too many people, or it'll cost too much, or it'll disrupt the system in the United States as we've known it, the economic system and those who are privileged by that system. So there is a real problem with this country with all these lawyers running around that don't know anything about human rights law. So getting to the point about litigation and litigation strategies, you know, litigation is sometimes dangerous. It's not always the right strategy, because sometimes we can lose. Because we have justice systems that are often stacked against us. And when you talk about poor communities that are trying to hang on to a little shelter they have in communities that they love because their roots are there, and possibly risking it by losing a case, in addition to not being able to afford, you know, even lawyers that offer their services at no cost or low cost, litigation can be a very painful strategy to pursue. CORE does employ litigation as a strategic tool. We think it's important, particularly where there's an opportunity to win a case and establish new jurisprudence regarding the recognition and implementation of rights and laws supporting the right to adequate housing. But part, I think, of what an international housing rights organization can do and should do, particularly vis-a-vis the United States, is point out this enormous discrepancy between what the United States says and what it does. The enormous hypocrisy of a country that is the wealthiest country in the history of humankind, and yet tolerates and supports such high levels of impoverishment and such massive violations of housing rights. We can and we do work with the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, with NESRI in New York, with the U.S. Human Rights Network, of which we're also a member, because we believe it's absolutely critical in the United States that this movement for human rights deepen and broaden its work in the United States, so that the United States ultimately will be brought into compliance with international human rights law. But it's only through the work of these kinds of organizations and this kind of creative energy that's going to make that happen. We're struggling just to try and get the international media to even pay attention to the fact that the United States is going through a universal periodic review here in Geneva on Friday. And the last thing I'll say is we also have to bear in mind the ignorance and the hostility that ignorance brings in the United States. You know, in the current foreclosure crisis, you have this false notion in the United States among many people that, well, those people who borrow too much money, that they couldn't afford to pay back those loans, they deserve what they get. They deserve to be thrown out on the street. We shouldn't have to pay off their loans. There's a great deal of hostility, of blaming the victim, of criminalizing the homeless, and that's a very deep cultural phenomenon that we all have to take responsibility for trying to change in the United States. Thank you.
All right, I realize that we're coming up on the end here, so I'll get one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, actually, I don't have really a question. I'd just like to make a comment and thanking you to mention Native Americans, because Shoshone is from Nevada, and our people have been coming up here to Geneva since it was beginning of it was the League of Nations. So that long we've been asking the United States to recognize our treaty, which entails like 85% of Nevada, and we've been. And it's been ratified. It's a supreme law of the land, but they don't look at it that way. But all these issues that's happening here is now happening to everybody else. So we're pretty much all in the same boat. And I would like to say that, you know, everybody looks at the human rights issue. You got the right, inherent right to air, clean water, all that. So that's part of everything. And I hope that we all make some kind of headway. Thanks.
Thanks, and yeah, I mean, there was a reason I specifically, in the introductory remarks, mentioned the Native American populations. It's, I mean, if anybody in the world doubts that there's housing rights issues in the U.S., the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing last year in her mission, we specifically asked for her to go to see the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and she said, you know, she was shocked. She lives in Brazil, where, you know, the favelas, the slums there are horrible, and she said she had never seen anything that bad at all for travels all around the world. I mean, it's and this is housing that's explicitly provided under treaty obligations that the U.S. government committed to hundreds of years ago. I mean, there's ways the government can, you know, excuse itself for responsibility in some cases from the conditions that private developers may put people into. But when it's the government's own actions directly that are putting people into the housing conditions, the health-threatening, life-threatening conditions that they're in a lot of Indian housing, it's you know, something that they really should be ashamed of. And just to wrap up, coming back to John Woo's question about the civil disobedience, there's a group in the U.S. Coordinating with the Land and Housing Rights Action Group of the U.S. Human Rights Network called Take Back the Land, who's been conducting civil disobedience actions, constructing tent cities, doing housing takeovers all across the U.S. And their executive director, Max Remo, said in an interview once, the interviewer was asking him, you know, isn't what you're doing illegal? Isn't moving people into these empty homes that they don't own, isn't that illegal? And he said, well, 40 years ago, it would have been illegal for me to sit on the same seat as a white person on the bus. We didn't think that law was just. We didn't think that law upheld human rights. It's the same with the laws that say it's okay for people to be homeless when there are empty houses that could be housing them. That's the difference that human rights makes. That's why we want our right to housing, and that's why we need the U.S. to be held accountable to that right here this week in Geneva. So thank you all for your attention, and yeah, let's go out there and make some change.